Hello and welcome to my presentation, Beyond Reinforcement, Alternate Training Skills Explored. My name is Tristan Flynn, and this was a presentation that I gave earlier this year at one of the larger dog training conferences in the US. I wanted to record it because this presentation was interrupted multiple times during the presentation, and it was quite controversial because it was given to a crowd that used positive reinforcement-based training like I do. However, this presentation talks about different techniques such as body blocking. We discuss a lot about punishment and also guided learning. So these are not positive reinforcement-based techniques. However, it's very important that if we are a positive-based trainer or any type of dog trainer, that we understand these techniques in detail. And I'm going to present you a lot of science about this today. If you'd like to know more about my biography, you can visit jollytails.ca. That's a company that I co-own in Halifax that does daycare, training, grooming, and retail. And this is a little bit about my biography, which again, you can explore in detail at jollytails.ca. The learning objectives for this webinar today is to learn how to apply non-reinforcement training techniques and to reduce behavioral fallout. We're also going to learn when it is appropriate to use alternatives to rewards. We're going to expand your training toolbox to better solve problems for clients. And we're going to understand how to ensure your methods are humane and effective. So this presentation is primarily for professional dog trainers. However, pet owners and pet parents can learn a lot from this presentation and re-examine some of the techniques you may be using with your dogs. The dog training landscape today is very confusing. However, dog training is divided into generally two major camps. We have compulsion-based trainers who primarily use shock collars. They might use very harsh corrections, prong collars to ensure dogs perform the behaviors that the trainers and the owners want. They usually wait for undesired behaviors and then apply punishment to stop them. Or they may use negative reinforcement as well. But the reward for these dogs is the lack or the absence of pain and punishment. The reward-based trainer, on the other hand, rewards desired behaviors, and generally they focus on training alternative behaviors versus punishing the behavior that's undesirable. They generally avoid punishment entirely, and they might avoid negative reinforcement as well. But the greatest skills that all dog trainers possess are similar between the two camps. You need to have a thorough understanding of the science of learning. You have to have a good physical handling techniques with dogs. You generally need to have a good relationship and understanding of the subject that you're training. You need to have good speed. You need to have good timing and the ability to quickly switch criteria in a training session. You have to understand the subject's motivation for the behavior in the current picture and also the big picture of the subject's life. And you have to know when to apply different techniques based on the dog's comfort and the responses that the dog is giving you. And if we want to combat shock, prong, and force-based training, we have to understand it. If you know me, I'm very outspoken against the use of shock collars particularly, and the use of any force-based training. However, if we're going to do that, we have to understand the science of not only how it works, but why it's problematic. Our opposition to force-based training should not be based on the fact that it does not work, but rather that it should be an ethical argument. So we need to be very careful with making grand statements like shock collar training doesn't work or forceful training doesn't work, because it certainly does work. Generally, the behaviors will in fact happen, but there are other issues with that. But punishment is generally not understood by most positive-based trainers, and if we want to discuss it, or especially if we want to employ it, we have to understand it very highly. And my general dog training mantra is the golden rule, which is that I don't do anything to dogs that I would not want them to do to me. And I'm going to ask a couple questions of someone, especially if you are a reward-based trainer, which is, if you are a reward-based dog trainer, should we ever use punishment or negative reinforcement? Are those things that should ever enter into our toolbox? When we look at LIMA, which is least intrusive, minimally adversive, that's what that stands for, which means that we are going to use techniques that are minimally invasive. If they fail, we are basically going to keep going down the ladder into more invasive types of behavior modification. So how do we decide when reward-based training has failed? Is it okay to say no to a dog? Should we ever let them know that we are unhappy with their behavior? And is it okay to use force when a dog invades our space or if they are extremely rude with us? And can we ever truly avoid all adversives with our dogs? These are going to be some of the questions I want you to think about as we go through this presentation. This is Dr. Susan Friedman's hierarchy of behavior change. And this basically tells trainers that when you start working with behavior modification, you always start on the road of health, nutrition, and physical setting. You then move to antecedent arrangements, positive reinforcement, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. Then you have a warning sign when you get into using such techniques like extinction, negative reinforcement, negative punishment, and a big warning when you move into positive punishment. So the question I have is there times where we should skip ahead to punishment if we know that that is a more effective technique for the behavior modification, especially if we are under time constraints and client restraints, meaning the client wants something done very, very quickly? And the other question is, should punishment be employed simultaneously to the other 4 reward-based steps, especially if we understand the behavior we're trying to modify? So my position is that if you are an experienced trainer, you can actually look at doing all of these steps simultaneously. So there are going to be times where we do reward a behavior, but we are also going to potentially instantly punish the negative behavior as well. We aren't going to wait to do more positive training. We might actually want to give the dog a punishment or some other type of training technique to let them know that that behavior is unwanted and to move the learning ahead faster. So when we hear the word punishment, a lot of people think that this is a very negative thing. It's a very mean thing. We're going to hurt the dog. So that's another large question is, do punishments have to be painful, and do punishments have to be scary in order to be effective? And the answer to that question is no. A punishment involves presenting an unfavorable outcome or event following an undesirable behavior. So unfavorable outcomes are not painful or scary. They're simply undesired. Punishment often only works if the punisher is present as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But the key thing here is that punishments do not have to be scary and they don't have to be hurtful. There are some value to understanding and utilizing punishment. It's very helpful to a subject to know which behaviors are undesired, especially if they are self-reinforcing or if you are unable to control the reinforcer. A punishment could also simply be a lack or cessation of a reward. So when you think of a dog who is being rewarded over and over again, if those rewards cease, generally that can be considered a punishment because it's an undesirable outcome that can then reduce behavior. Punishment is generally happening all the time in our lives, so it makes sense that we try to think about how we can harness it as trainers trying to influence behavior. And the value of punishment as well is that it works very quickly if it's done correctly, and that's the key word, that it's done correctly. But I want you to remember that clients are results driven, and that is why shock collar trainers are on the rise, especially in my area of Canada, because they get instant behavior. And not that that is something we should do, but it's something we need to, again, understand. When should we consider punishment? This is a very huge question, especially when it comes to the welfare of the dog. And these are some of my very critical, important rules if we're going to talk about utilizing punishment in dog training. Punishment should never compel a behavior. It should simply cease one. So for example, we are going to say to the dog, you can do anything but this. We are not going to say to a dog, you must do this behavior or else. So we are going to give dogs a free range of choice. We're never going to say to them, you must do only this behavior or else you will incur punishment. That's very important, point 1. Point 2 is that the dog's freedom of choice is always respected. It's not limited to one action. So they have multiple things that the dog must be able to perform. Punishment must always be a constructive training option. It is not used for revenge, retribution, or when we're angry. Remember, we always punish behaviors. We never punish dogs. And when the behavior is driven by an operant choice, not classical conditioning or an emotional response. This is a very critical rule of punishment. So we are never going to punish aggression. Aggression is completely off limits. If we know a dog's choice is being driven by an emotional state, by fear, which is generally what drives aggression. We cannot use punishment. So punishment is very effective for space invasion. So dogs who are jumping, who are biting at us, not in an aggressive way, but in a nuisance way, or any type of rudeness. And other nuisance behaviors are also good targets for punishment, things like barking and vocalization. And we're going to look at some of those examples later on, how to actually apply that. Punishments to avoid, and we touched on this, is the inducing action. So compulsion is applied to induce a dog to execute an action that it does not want to perform. Under the influence of compulsion, the dog is wedged between two opposing possibilities, the performing of an undesirable action and being compelled by force to perform it. So this is a very difficult position for the dog because they have an avoidance conflict. There's something they don't want to do, but if they don't do it, they're going to incur a force-based punishment. So this is not something we ever want to do, is forcing the dog to choose between two equally undesirable alternatives. And this is why balanced training is generally a myth. There's no such thing as a balanced dog trainer. If you have a dog who is being forced into a sit-stay by a shock collar, and if they stay in position, they're rewarded with a treat, the treat is irrelevant. What's keeping the dog in the position is the threat of the shock collar. So for balanced trainers to say, well, we're going to reward the dog if they do what we want, but then if they don't do what we want, we're going to compel them, really the positive aspect of that is irrelevant. And in fact, the dog would perform the exact same behavior without the positive rewards at all, because it is the punishment and the inducing action that's compelling it. So this is why balanced training is generally a myth. Punishments that we must be very careful with is compelling abstention. So this is when we're going to have a dog abstain from executing an action that the dog wants to perform. We get a dog who can be conflicted between its desire to consummate the forbidden action and the pending threat of the adversive stimulation if it fails to abstain from doing so. So when we think about this, when the adversiveness of compulsion is motivationally equal to the reward value of the forbidden activity, then a disruption of approach avoidance conflict may ensue. So for example, if you have a dog who wants to chase a rabbit that is on the other side of an electric fence, you may find that the dog will in fact go through that electric fence because he is so motivated and so driven to chase after that item. So you have to be very careful that if you are trying to get a dog to abstain from an action, that you actually can do that. And so sometimes these punishments can be useless, and we have to be very, very careful if we're looking at trying to design one. And punishments to avoid completely is non-contingent punishment, and this is the punishment that most owners use. There is no clear understanding by the subject as to the behavior being punished. This is when dogs do not understand at all why they're being punished. Unfortunately, the benefit of this is generally that the dog will shut down. So you will have the suppression of the unwanted behavior rather through the dog being fearful than the dog actually understanding that they should not engage in that particular action. So owners often see this as a success, as the fact that the dog has shut down. So for example, if a dog is shocked in a room and the owner believes that the dog has learned to stay away from that room through punishment, generally the dog just becomes fearful of that room, and so he avoids it because he's fearful, not because it's been a constructive punishment and he knows to avoid that room, but rather because it's a fear-based understanding to stay away from that room. And that can generally start to spill into other aspects of the dog's life. He might become fearful of other rooms, or he might become a fearful dog in general, for example, when people are using non-contingent punishment. Misuse of punishment. Most owners have attempted to use punishment, generally with no results, or even worse, they have fallout and problems with their dogs. Often pet owners are very ineffective at using it, and it becomes abuse, and the behavior gets worse. And that means that it no longer meets the definition of punishment, which means that if you believe that you are employing punishment to your dog and the behavior is not reducing, then you are no longer employing punishment. You are probably just abusing your dog. So the behavior needs to decrease, and it needs to decrease very quickly. We have to also recognize that classical conditioning is always present in operant conditioning. So if we use any type of forceful based punishment, that's going to create negative associations and the behavioral fallout and the behavioral effect that will come with that. So we have to always remember that no matter what we do to our dogs, there is always a classical conditioning component. Oftentimes when you're delivering punishment, the owner is often the punisher. And so the dog can't escape, especially if the dog might be on leash or restrained. And so this can cause a lot of stress of our dogs. So to be very mindful that if we are the ones employing the punishment, that can create relationship issues, it can create stress issues, and we have to be very mindful of that. And if we have a stressed out dog, we're not going to have a thinking dog. So first and foremost, any type of punishment that we are looking at employing, it cannot create a massive amount of stress in the dog. And punishment also doesn't address any frustration or fear that the dog has. So we have to understand the dog's motivation for a behavior before we can think about employing punishment. And again, we must understand the lifestyle of the dog. So the graphic from the earlier slide is relevant because we must do all things simultaneously. One of those roadmaps cannot be ignored when we are looking at the other aspects of that roadmap. And owners and trainers are often generally ignorant of the complexity of proper punishment structures. And that's what I'm going to attempt to outline in our very critical rules of punishment. These are rules of punishment that if you cannot follow these rules, that you should not be using punishment. So I'm going to walk you through each one. The first one, it should only be used after positive training has been exhausted or is no longer practical for the client. So for example, a new puppy is more likely to be trained using only rewards not to bark than a dog who's 10 years old and has been a serial barker. So we need to use positive training first and foremost before we consider entering into punishment. However, we need to look at the aspects of how realistic is this for the client and for the dog themselves. The trainer must never punish out of anger or spite, and the punishment must be a constructive training option. The punishment must be immediate with no delay, and preferably it overlaps the target response. So it must be immediate. This is critical, and by immediate we mean within 1 second. The punishment should occur at the earliest point in the behavioral sequence targeted for suppression. So it must happen in the earliest point. You cannot punish a behavior that has already been occurring for some time. An alternative incompatible behavior should always be prompted and reinforced if possible. Unless the punished behavior is replaced with an adequate substitute, the effective punishment may be temporary, requiring that it be applied over and over again with diminishing net results. It is critical that if we do not want a dog to perform a behavior and we are going to employ punishment, that there is an incompatible behavior and that it is highly reinforced. I generally tell my clients that if they are going to employ punishment, they must be rewarding an alternate behavior at a ratio of about 10 to 1. So you cannot let clients or trainers focus on simply being obsessed with punishment. They must be rewarding an alternative behavior or the punishment will become ineffective. We must avoid excessively harsh punishments. Dogs should never be abused. And a failing punishment must not be escalated. An antecedent signal should always be paired with the punisher, hopefully taking its place and allowing the animal predictive control over their occurrence. So we must always signal when the punishment's about to happen, and then in the future, that antecedent signal should be able to replace the punishment. So for example, if we are saying or quiet or no right before a punishment for barking, then hopefully that will then take the actual punishment's place in the future and be a signal to the dog to cease that behavior. When possible, avoid interactive punishment. So for example, booby traps are desired versus interaction with the trainer to avoid the classical conditioning and fear related with the responses. And be aware evasion will definitely increase under a punishment regime, and punishment may only work in the presence of the punisher. So when dogs understand that we as the owners are employing the punishment, they will generally try to avoid us. So this is just a fact of punishment. We have to understand that this is going to happen. And we have to also understand that there's going to be negative classical conditioning if the punishment is unwanted, and that if we can have a remote punishment such as a booby trap or another person doing it, then that is desired. Select punishers that are relevant to the underlying motivation driving the unwanted behavior. So for example, we want to have timeouts for attention. We might use a booby trap for a dog that's counter surfing. We want to use punishers that are relevant to what the dog is trying to do. We also want to select punishers on the basis of their significance to the sensory impact most directly linked to the unwanted behavior being suppressed. So for example, we might have a startle sound for barking. If a dog is wanting to move forward on a leash, we might turn them around. And so this is what we want to look at. Fit the punishment to the dog's temperament and behavior. A punitive event that is excessive for one dog may be barely effective for another. So it's very important we have a thorough understanding of dog body language, generally a relationship with the dog, and understanding what is excessive for that dog, and to make sure we're never stressing out and being abusive to the dogs that we're training. The most effective punishments also possess an element of surprise. It's very important that generally the dog not see this punishment coming. Adversive punishment is most effective when it generates a startle response at the moment of its delivery. Not pain, not scary, but a startle. Only ever punish one behavior at a time. If you correct more than one behavior at a time, often the dog will get confused, and generally the trainer will get confused as well. So focus on one behavior at a time, not multiple. Do not escalate punishment incrementally, but use a sufficiently strong punishment from the beginning. The gradual escalation of punishment results in its systematic habituation. So it's very important that we try to do this. And this is why punishment, again, is not necessarily an effective way to train dogs, because so many of these rules are very, very difficult. And this is one of the more difficult ones. And so this presentation is not about necessarily recommending lots of punishment, but about getting you to understand how difficult it can be to employ this. We need to vary the type of punishment. One punisher may work in one situation, but not another. A punisher that doesn't work within 3 to 5 trials should be reevaluated and likely abandoned. So many owners often use punishment that is not effective. Think of dogs who are pulling on leash, who the owner is leash correcting them, and you see that same owner years later and they're still delivering leash corrections and the dog is still pulling. That is not an effective punishment. Make certain that the behavior being punished is not also being reinforced inadvertently if possible. And the behavior must not be in need. So we cannot punish a hungry dog for trying to countersurf if that dog is starving. We have to always remember that the target of the punishment is the dog's behavior, not the dog. You should also consider your relationship with the subject carefully. If you are going to employ a punishment with a dog you just met, that may warrant a very different response from the dog than if it is a dog you have a very good relationship with and also a very high reward history with that dog. And number 20, you need to be consistent. And if you cannot follow all or the vast majority of these 20 rules, it is best to avoid punishment entirely. The difficult use of effective punishment usually far outweighs the skill of the trainer. And this is why punishment is generally not something we should employ. And if we do employ it, we must have a very detailed plan, and we must apply the 20 rules, and we must understand if our punishment is fitting with these 20 rules. So if you as a dog trainer are going to use punishment in your training, you should sit down and write out all 20 of these rules and see how your punishment matches up. If you don't follow these guidelines with proper skill, you will generally have a dog who is shut down or frustrated. You could also have a dog who shows aggression. You will have a loss of trust, a worsening of behavior, or a general confusion. Or you may also create learned helplessness, a dog who simply shuts down. So punishment is a very dangerous tool that we must employ very carefully, very sparingly. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of case studies on understanding how I have used punishment in an effective way to modify behavior. And this is the case study called Charlie the Humper. Charlie was a 1-year-old lab who was enrolled in our daycare. He had very poor social skills. He had been adopted out after being confined to a garage for approximately 1 year. He humped dogs generally out of confusion of what to do with them. So his humping was generally out of anxiety and confusion. He liked dogs. He would wag his tail when he saw dogs, but he didn't know what to do with them. And the owners enrolled him in daycare because they wanted to improve his social skills. They desperately wanted to be able to take him to a dog park, have him play with dogs, have him engage with other dogs. The problem with a dog who serial humps is that oftentimes the dogs did not like him because they did not like that behavior. It was also a risk to him because dogs who would be around him and then be engaging in his serial humping would escalate in their aggression because, of course, they were trying to deliver their own punishments to tell him to stop. And unfortunately, the only way that he would generally stop is if they escalated it to the point where they would hurt him. Of course, this didn't happen, but this was always the fear that dogs would have to get very aggressive with him to get him to stop because he didn't stop. He didn't know what else to do. So the way we modified Charlie's behavior was, again, we looked at all aspects of his life. We dealt with his nutrition, we dealt with his home life, so that was all fine, but we still had this problem behavior. So what we did is Charlie was praised whenever he engaged with the dog and doing anything other than humping. So Charlie was allowed to do anything he wanted, he just couldn't hump. So if he sniffed a dog, if he looked at a dog, if he walked past a dog, if he barked at a dog, anything he did with a dog that did not involve him trying to climb a board. If Charlie started to hump, he was given a verbal correction, and then he was physically pulled off the dog. So we would say, and then we would pull him off the dog as soon as he started to try to get on them. If he tried twice to hump, he was given a 5-minute crate timeout. So we would grab him, we would lead him directly into a crate, and we would put him into the crate for usually 5 minutes, sometimes even less than that. His behavior was modified within 2 to 3 daycare visits, and his humping greatly decreased as confidence and behavior choices improved. So what we found was if we were able to punish his humping, he would have no choice but to engage in other types of behaviors. So he started learning social skills, he started playing with dogs, he was highly praised for this, but anytime the humping tried to creep in, we were there to jump in with a very quick punishment, which again was pulling him off, putting him in a crate if it was excessive, and the antecedent started to become his punishment. So the staff were able to say, Charlie, if he was trying to hump a dog, and he would immediately stop. So again, this kept him safe because the other dogs did not have to then try to tell him off. So let's analyze this behavior. Well, first of all, the dogs wanted to correct him. So the dogs themselves wanted to employ punishment. However, they are not able to deliver a timeout. The only thing the dogs could do would be to bite at him. And so this is not an effective punishment for Charlie, and that violates some of the rules we were talking about, which was he still wanted to engage with them. So even if the dogs were actually being aggressive towards him, sometimes Charlie actually thought that was okay. And in fact, he had attended a previous daycare where dogs had actually went after him, but he never fought back. He was a very safe, friendly dog. But unfortunately, the dogs themselves were not able to follow the rules of punishment. So that was not an effective punishment for Charlie actually being told off by the other dogs. It's the timeout and the removal from the dogs that was the effective punishment. So did we provide him lots of choices? Certainly. He was able to do anything he wanted other than the one target behavior. Was it painful or scary? So was this abusive, what we did to Charlie? Was this terrible? Does this make me a horrible person? I don't believe so. It was not a painful punishment. We weren't, jerking him by the collar. We were simply pulling him by the collar, leading him out. It wasn't scary. I mean, he knew what was coming. If he was grabbed suddenly from behind, he never reacted. He never tried to bite. He never tried to escape. He generally would just be kind of disappointed that he was being led out of the daycare. So certainly it was something that he didn't like, but it was not something that was scary. It was not something that was causing him pain. He was also very comfortable in a crate. He was not scared of a crate. He just didn't want to be in the crate. He wanted to be out with the dogs. But certainly if he was confined at home, for example, Or when he was confined for our lunch break that we give dogs, he did not show any signs of being in the crate. So we weren't throwing him in the crate to put him in a place that was scary for him. So did we follow the rules of punishment? It was immediate. This was a key part of the punishment, was that we always make sure that it happened immediately. So there had to be staff very close to Charlie. There had to be someone following him at all times and be within about a foot of him at all times, or else the punishment would have been ineffective. We did not want to grab him after he had already gotten on a dog or had been there for a while. So it had to be immediate. It was consistent. Myself and my staff made sure that every single time this behavior happened, we were there to do it. So we did not take our eyes off him. There was always someone watching this, so it was a consistent punishment. He was warned. There was an antecedent signal that, in fact, after the punishment hadn't been employed for several days, was then utilized basically for the rest of his daycare experience. So we could always say, Charlie, if he was looking at humping, which again happened very rarely, but that was an effective punishment for the rest of his time, simply the warning. It also occurred first in the behavior chain. So generally, as soon as we saw him sniffing a dog's butt or trying to go behind them, we would generally employ the punishment. So we would either warn him or we would get close to him, which all indicated that the punishment was coming. And so he understood that that was not something he should be doing, because again, the punishment was then going to follow through. It was not done in anger. No one ever angrily grabbed him. He was a dog that we were all trying to help, a dog everyone very much liked and liked their owners. So certainly this was not a punishment that we were doing because anybody was angry with him. It was consistent with the motivation. So his motivation was interacting with dogs, and he learned through the punishment that if he engaged in that behavior, that he would lose access to the dogs. Alternatives were rewarded. So they were rewarded not only by the staff praising him, and of course as a lab he generally liked praise a lot, but he was also rewarded by the engagement with the dogs. So every moment he was with the dogs was a reward for him. So all of his play behaviors that were returned, when he got to engage successfully with the dog, these were all also self-rewarding for him. We only punished one behavior, so the only thing we were concerned with was humping. We were not concerned with vocalization or anything else. And the other thing is that this worked quickly. We saw a very quick behavior change. Now, one of the things to understand with Charlie is he actually attended another daycare for some time performing this behavior. He had been injured minorly by another dog telling him off. And in fact, the other daycare had actually removed him or asked that he be removed because of his constant humping. And so the owners were looking for a solution because he had been removed from the other daycare. They felt that they couldn't take him to a dog park. They didn't know how to change this behavior. And so we utilized our daycare in order to address this behavior. And so this behavior changed within about 2 to 3 days of attending our play groups, where he had been in the other play groups for weeks. So we knew for sure that this strategy that we were employing was actually modifying the behavior quite quickly. So was there any failure? Well, one of the rules we couldn't follow was that it was definitely associated with the trainer. So he did know that we were the ones putting him in the timeout. It did result in some evasion, but generally there was multiple staff. The trainers and the staff were pretty fast, and also the evasion stopped the behavior, so the result was achieved. So for example, if he was trying to hump a dog and he saw me coming towards him, he would stop the behavior because then he would try to evade me, and so then of course I would stop trying to go get him. So it actually worked quite well because that actually became an antecedent, which was he knew that if he was engaging in that behavior and he saw us coming, he was going to get a timeout, and so he would stop the behavior. So in fact, just the particular motion towards him of the staff, he kind of understood what was happening. Dogs are very smart. He definitely knew when we were approaching him to give him a timeout versus when we were approaching him for other reasons. He actually was very friendly with the staff, but he certainly knew when the punishment was coming and he might try some evasion. But the benefit of this was that the punishment was no longer needed once his new social behaviors were learned. So once he was able to engage in behaviors not related to humping because the humping was being suppressed through the punishment, he was actually able to learn other behaviors. He was not able to learn those behaviors when the humping was not being punished because that was the only behavior he would engage in. So he didn't have an opportunity to learn other behaviors. And this is why the punishment was such an effective part of this behavior modification, because it prevented Charlie from learning new behaviors when this was the only behavior that he would engage in. And so once he became a social dog, he learned other behaviors, he learned how to play with dogs, the punishment was no longer needed and he had alternative behaviors to perform. So that's Charlie. I think that was one of the most successful uses of punishment that I've seen. Again, punishment is not something that I use very often in training, but to ignore it in a particular case like that is ineffective. And I think that Charlie's case really shows that it can be an effective tool if you understand it. So we're going to talk about timeouts. Again, the punishment I generally employ is always negative-based punishment. So timeouts, very effective. Negative punishment, very effective. But punishment itself should not be a dirty word. But generally, positive punishment is not something that I employ. Generally, negative punishment is what we're talking about when we discuss punishment. So timeouts are kind of their own realm. Timeouts are effective at the moment they are delivered. And the time between the behavior and entering the timeout must be immediate. So it was very important that when you look at Charlie, we not be far away from him, and also that he be able to get into his timeout area quite quickly. So we don't want to be dragging him, across a very long room. So generally this was restricted to our inside area where the crates are quite available. The duration of the break should be kept short, never exceeding 2 to 5 minutes. It's a big mistake to think that the duration of the timeout is effective. Once the dog has been put in a timeout area, generally that's message received. The duration then is irrelevant, so we don't really need to keep dogs there much longer than a couple of minutes. When we're employing a timeout, it is important to be aware that the timeout area may become poisoned. So there is, of course, a risk that if you put a dog in a crate for a timeout or in a certain room, that they may not like that room anymore. So this is something we have to be very aware of. A timeout from a reward-dense situation will have a stronger effect over the unwanted target behavior than a timeout from a punishment-dense situation. So remember that if a dog is having a very good time and they're giving a timeout, that's definitely going to be negative for the dog. If the dog is giving a timeout from, let's say, a shock collar session or a punishment-based session, in fact, that might actually be relief. So that is not going to be an effective timeout. So if the dog isn't having a good time and you give them a timeout, that's not really going to be effective. A timeout should be viewed as effective damage control. It is not the primary leverage point of change. So for example, with Charlie, it was really about damage control. It was about saying we got to stop this behavior somehow. The primary leverage point of change was generally his ability to perform the other behaviors with the other dogs and to learn his new social skills. The timeout was simply done to control that particular behavior that needed to be suppressed. There's a couple of different types of timeouts that I want to discuss. An exclusionary timeout. The timeout involves removing the dog from the training situation. The most common way to confine a dog is to place the dog in a bathroom or another separate room. So that's an exclusionary timeout where the dog is removed from the training situation. A non-exclusionary timeout involves withdrawing reinforcement or socially isolating or removing the dog. So for example, non-exclusionary timeouts are effective in cases where reward training is ongoing. So we're providing lots of rewards and then the rewards cease. So such timeouts can be carried out simply by just turning away from the dog. We might not give them cues anymore that they know earns them rewards. And this particular variation is useful for the control of many mild playful exercises. So kind of a cold shoulder if a dog is doing behaviors that we don't like. Reverse timeout is if we decide to actually leave. So rather than putting the dog in a crate or placing the dog in another area, we ourselves leave. So we would immediately leave the dog if they perform an undesired behavior. This is the type of timeout that I would prefer, especially if a dog has any type of issues being handled or grabbed or led somewhere. Again, if the dog is very resistant to those things, we need to listen to the dog. We need to adjust our plan. So a reverse timeout is very, very effective because the dog is not forced to do anything whatsoever. This is how I generally would perform a reverse timeout. I would especially if you're working with rescue dogs. This is something I used to do a lot of. I would tether the dog to an object, such as a fence or a post. So I would tether them on a fairly long leash so they had lots of room to move. I would work with the dog through rewards within the zone. So if I had a dog tethered to the fence, I would be with him. I would be working on reward-based training cues. However, if the dog did an undesirable behavior, so if I had a dog who was obsessively jumping at me, if I had a dog who was mouthing at me, I would have dogs that might even try to hump me, then I would immediately retreat and wait outside the working zone. So I would immediately move away from the dog so they no longer had access to me. I would also follow the other critical punishment rules. So the timing, the warnings, the alternate behavior. So all 20 of those rules, when we are applying timeouts, those 20 rules of punishment still apply. So we have to be able to analyze how our timeouts are being used. But generally, if you're working with a rescue dog or a very frustrated dog who is going to perform undesirable behaviors like chewing on your jacket or trying to rip your pants off or humping you or doing anything like that, this is a very effective way to work with them and suppress those behaviors. And once those behaviors have been successfully suppressed through the timeouts, then oftentimes you can start working with the dog in regular areas, like on a leash, on a walk, where you don't have to worry about trying to do a timeout for these behaviors. So again, this is a very critical method that a lot of people don't use that can be very effective in immediately suppressing some of these very rude behaviors. And again, when we're talking about dogs in a shelter, ideally they would not be performing these behaviors because they would have a good life. They would not be in a kennel all day. But the fact of the matter is that they are. And they need to understand that they can't be jumping all over people, biting them, mounting them, because that's not going to get them adopted. So we need to modify those behaviors. And this is a very effective way to doing it. And this actually ignores probably the lifestyle section of looking at behavior change, because we know we're unable to address that if a dog is being confined in a kennel at a shelter. So again, timeouts are a very, very effective way to modify behavior, especially if you know that there may not be other available means to do so. So here's a case study of a dog who was a serial barker. If you know the breed Samoyed, they are usually very, very vocal. So this was a dog that came for obedience training. He was about 2 years old when he enrolled in a group obedience class, and he barked a lot. So he was barking nonstop. You know, you could record, 10 barks in about 10 seconds with him. His breed disposition is to be vocal, so we understand that he's going to be a very vocal dog. He got bored very quickly with a poor handler, so with a handler who was not experienced in giving him quick cues. He didn't know a lot of cues. His handler wasn't very fast at the time. She got excellent by the end of class, but he was very, very vocal, and so he was always barking because he was bored. He was barking because he wanted things, and so he used vocalization to express a lot of his desires that way. But when I looked at him and assessed him, I did not believe that he was stressed out. He was simply bored, and he seemed to enjoy barking. It's again something that's kind of hardwired in him. So he wasn't barking because he was stressed out. He was just bored. He wanted something to do. He didn't want to be on leash. So, you know, you could try to argue that was stress, but I don't think that's pure stress in the true definition. But he necessarily wanted to be able to do whatever he could do. He didn't really want to be in class. So how did we address getting him to stop barking just even long enough so we could work with him a little bit and we could talk and not be driven kind of crazy by how much he was barking? So what we did is he was rewarded for many different behaviors, and he was often cued for things that he knew. So we tried to keep him busy. We tried to give him a lot of cues. We tried to work with him and get him performing behaviors very quickly. However, if he barked, we would open the gate that he was working beside, and we would just lead him out into the gate by the leash, and we would just basically lead him out of the room to the outside, and we would shut the door to the gate for about 10 seconds. So when he barked, we opened the gate, we would just lead him by the lead through the gate, and then we would shut the gate, oftentimes still holding on to the leash. So he was visible, he was just outside this gate. And what we found is that his behavior was modified within about 10 minutes after about 4 to 5 punishments. And we only needed to do about 2 or 3 more punishments for the rest of the 6-week course, which would be a 6-week, 1-hour-a-week course. So this worked very, very effectively because Obi did start to learn that if he barked, he would be removed from the training situation. Of course, this is a very reward-dense training situation. It is an all reward-based class, other than, of course, this particular type of punishment. And it was very effective in modifying his behavior. So analysis of his behavior was, first of all, it was a very annoying behavior. This was a behavior that needed to be modified quickly. A dog who was barking as much as he was going to result in the owner considering a shock bark collar. It might result in the owner thinking about getting rid of the dog. It might result in the owner getting complaints if she's living in an apartment. So a dog who is barking this much is very problematic, and it's something that a lot of clients need suppressed, and they usually need it suppressed quite quickly. So walking through the same analysis, did we provide him choices? Yes, we did. He could do anything other than bark. Was the punishment painful or scary? No, we were not leading him out of the gate harshly. We were not jerking him. We were not, being aggressive in the way we handled him. He was totally fine with it. He wouldn't resist. He wasn't looking stressed. He just didn't like it. He wanted to be in the room and he wanted to be engaging with you. He certainly didn't enjoy being removed from the reward-dense training situation, but it was not painful and it was not scary. Did we follow the rules? It was immediate, so as soon as he barked, the punishment would be employed. It was consistent, so it was done every time. He was always warned with a very quick ah. It occurred first in the behavior chain, so as soon as the bark happened. It was not done in anger. It was consistent with the motivation, so in fact he was removed from an area that he wanted to be in. Alternatives were rewarded, so he was highly rewarded for not only being quiet, but for offering other behaviors such as sitting or lying down or looking at dogs. But he was rewarded heavily for not barking or looking at things and not barking. We only punished one behavior. Barking was the only behavior we were concerned with, and it also worked very quickly. Now, the concerns were that it was associated with the trainer or the owner, but mostly the trainer to spare the owner. So in fact, I was the one that generally employed the punishment with him. I stood by her for the first few moments of class in order to do this so that it would not necessarily be associated with the owner. And we had to be very careful not to be forceful with the way that we were removing him, the way we were putting him behind the gate. He was wearing a harness when we did it, so we weren't jerking him around by a collar. He actually had a body harness on when we would lead him out of the room. And when I gave this presentation, originally people seemed very upset that I would move a dog physically. But again, this was not done harshly. It was just leading him out of the room very quickly whenever he would bark. And we had a bonus where he learned barking was not acceptable. And overall, his barking in other situations reduced, not just in class. So we didn't find that he associated it only with being in class, but rather he seemed to generalize the idea that punishment or that barking was an undesirable behavior that could result in punishment elsewhere. And even though there may not have been an effective way to punish him in other situations, he in fact stopped barking and his barking reduced greatly. And again, we're not trying to be unfair to the dog and say, well, you're a Samoyed and you're never allowed to bark again. It was just the massive amount of it. So he certainly would give off the odd bark here and there. And, we would sometimes look at each other and decide, hey, is this going to get a lot worse? And we might need to think about warning him or delivering the punishment. So again, he was allowed to bark. He was just not allowed to sit there and bark straight. So is there a role for punishment when we're training dogs? I believe it is appropriate to communicate when you are unhappy with your dog's behavior, but very importantly, we must clearly follow the rules of punishment and outline a plan for its use. So you must employ the 20 rules and understand how they're going to be employed. You have to be honest with yourself. If the dog is stressed, if the punishment is not working, if things are getting worse, then we need to analyze what we're doing. You should also consider asking another trainer for help. If you are not an effective trainer, if you don't feel that you are good at modifying this particular behavior, you might need to look at other alternatives and talk to another trainer before you use punishment. You have to also consider, what is my relationship with this animal? So again, a mild punishment with a dog that you know very well, dog may barely notice that, but if you do that with a dog that you just met, that's not a great idea. You need to have a relationship and an understanding of the dog you're working with. And again, we must always focus more on positive-based training skills. Those that use punishment are generally less skilled trainers. So again, the amount of times I use punishment is very minuscule. And when I gave this talk originally, people said, well, why are you giving a talk on something you barely use? And the reason is because there's lots of great positive reinforcement trainers out there that can talk about positive-based training. But this is a dark area that people don't understand. So not only do they not use it, but they don't understand it. So I like to explain this so people understand why we don't use punishment as much. Not that we want to start bringing it into our training in a mass regard, but we understand why we can't employ punishment, why there are so many situations where it does not work, and why there are so many situations where it's not something we can consider, but not because you simply are ignorant of punishment, but because you understand the guidelines and some of the material that I presented today, so you understand why it's not a good, effective choice for the dog that you're training. So I'm going to step away from punishment, and I'm going to talk briefly about a few other techniques. Body blocking is a somewhat useful technique. It's important that you not intimidate the dog when you're using it, but it can be used to move an animal away from a resource, or it can be used to defend personal space. So for example, if a dog is trying to get up on a couch, you don't want them there. Once you've gotten the dog off the couch through luring or cueing, then one of the best ways you can prevent them is then you, in fact, getting on the couch. So a lot of dogs will not invade your personal space. Now, someone had asked me, well, what if they do? Well, if they do, if a dog is willing to invade your personal space and they have no problem jumping on top of you or ramming right into you, then body blocking no longer becomes a useful technique. So if the dog is ignoring the general associated rules of not invading another animal's space, then it becomes kind of a useless technique. But it's natural for dogs to accept this from many species. You've probably seen videos of dogs who won't climb up the stairs because there's a cat there, or dogs who will not go past a dog who's lying down because they don't want to invade their space. If you're going to use body blocking, it must be done calmly, not aggressively, and not quickly. And generally what we would do is we would block the dog, we would retreat, and we would repeat. So I'll give you an example. If I have two dogs who are chewing bones, they're at a distance apart from one another, and I don't want them to go and harass each other for trying to get each other's bones. So I don't want one dog to try to play the game where they're going to go and steal the other dog's bone even though theirs hasn't been done and finished, or if their bone is finished and they want to go harass the other dog. If I have two dogs at a distance chewing their bones, I might be sitting on a couch, and if I see one dog get up to go towards the other dog, I would stand up, I would get in front of the dog, and I would prevent him from going towards the other dog to harass him for his resource. Generally, if the dog tries to get past me, I would block him again, and then once he goes back to his bone or he retreats, then I would sit back down on the couch, and I would repeat that until the dog stopped trying to go near the space of the other dog. And so that's an effective way where I can use my body to control a dog from going near another dog, and teach that dog that, hey, you're not allowed to go over there. I don't want you to invade that dog's space because he has a resource and I know that's going to create conflicts. That's one way that I might use that. You might also use it for counter surfing. So again, if you're standing by a counter and you're rewarding a dog for not going up on the counter, if you see him try to start leaping on the counter, you could very quickly move in front of him. So it's very effective for that. Can also be effective for blocking a dog from going through a door when you initially are teaching them to wait at the door. So if the dog tries to move through the door, you can very quickly move in front of them. And then if they sit, you can reward them and then you try again. So it becomes a very quick way to tell a dog that they shouldn't go that way. And so it does have some limited uses. It's very important not to do it in an intimidating way. And again, that you generally want to start rewarding alternate behaviors. So it's important to still kind of think of this along the realm of punishment and trying to make sure you are still following some of those rules, especially when it comes to immediacy and making sure alternatives are rewarded. One of the things we have to think about is space invaders. And there's been a bit of a shift with people where they feel very afraid to let dogs know when they've invaded our space. And so if I have a puppy who is biting my pants, who is shaking my pants, who is biting me hard, I don't see anything wrong with very quickly grabbing their collar, giving them a firm correction and saying no, provided I am giving other rewards to that dog. So making sure we are doing everything we need to do to teach that puppy not to do that. We're giving them outlets for the behavior through toys and things like that. But if you're standing there with your puppy and they are biting your pants and they are being fairly aggressive with you because they're frustrated, it's, again, still important that that dog be told that that is an unacceptable behavior. Even if they're frustrated, they are not allowed to bite you and rip at your pants. So a very quick collar grab and a firm verbal correction should not be something that we completely avoid. Although if we do go down that road, we have to, number one, remember our 20 rules of punishment. And we have to also remember that it needs to get better, not worse. So if this is going to escalate the behavior, we must immediately stop. We must immediately reevaluate. But the idea that having a dog biting you that's frustrated, it is not appropriate to grab them and say, hey, stop that, or else you are being a horrible person, I think is false. And we need to just kind of reevaluate and have a greater discussion around this. Guided learning is another technique that can be quite effective. And my definition for guided learning is showing the dog the correct behavior such that errors cannot occur. And so an example of this is a dog attempts to pull on a leash, and as soon as the dog forges forward, the handler immediately reverses direction. The dog has no choice but to walk in that direction on a loose leash. So the dog pulls, we instantly turn around and start walking the other way. The differentiating factor in this is that the method is not designed to force the dog to do the behavior, but that the dog is indifferent to what is happening or is willing to allow the guide. So for example, if I do turn and I try to walk in the other direction and the dog fights me, the dog doesn't want to be led in that direction, then it's no longer guided learning. If I yank on the leash and force him to walk with me, that's become now a punishment and I'm forcing him to move and I'm making him do a behavior. But if the dog really is indifferent to which way he goes, he just doesn't understand where to go, then this is a very effective method of saying to the dog, hey, this is not an option, and you don't allow the dog any chance to actually perform the wrong behavior. So again, the behavioral uses of that can be leash walking. So if a dog is trying to forge forward, I just instantly turn around. It can also be used for positional directing. So if I have two pylons and I want the dog to move from pylon A to pylon B, I can physically lead him to that pylon by the leash or any other means, provided again that the dog does not see it as forceful, simply to show the dog that I want you to go from here and then to here and then possibly to here. So the dog learns where they should go rather than allow them to make mistakes. So they have no way of making a mistake because they're being guided to the thing that I want them to do. And you can also use this for recall training. So for example, a dog who's off leash, or rather a dog who is on leash being held by someone else, is off in the woods. The owner calls the dog and the handler of the leash guides the dog back to the owner as soon as the cue is given and the dog is rewarded. So again, the dog is not dragged back to the handler, the dog is not forcibly led back to the handler, but rather the dog is guided and encouraged, but also ensuring that the dog does in fact go back to the handler and they don't have the freedom to make an error. So this is guided learning. We're not trying to force it on the dog. We are just trying to simply make sure the dog can't accidentally make a different choice. So the conclusions of this is that we must be very careful when using punishments, timeouts, and corrections. A solid plan should be developed and analyzed based on the dog. We must always adjust based on what the dog is telling you through observation. And if we find that a dog is being stressed, we find a dog is very confused, we must adjust. And if dogs are trained properly from the start, punishment is rarely needed, if ever. However, we don't live in a perfect world. Not everyone does early training, but people generally want results very quickly. And so there are methods we can use to achieve very quick results that should be carefully considered. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you'd like to contact me, you can reach me through my Twitter account. You can reach me through jollytails.ca. And thank you very much for listening.